This is a really tempting opportunity. I've known Richard for a long time, and when I first realized that I got to introduce him today, I thought, oh, the stories I could tell. So we agreed on the way over that it might be safer if I just stick to text, and I'm going to try to do that here. Richard is the founding director of the Wheatley Institution and will be 7 years old in about a week. So he's been doing that for the last 7 years. Prior to that, he was Associate Academic Vice President for Faculty here at BYU. He's a faculty member in the Psychology Department and has been since 1981. His research areas and areas in which he has written and said some really important things by my lights have had to do with the philosophical and theoretical and historical groundings of psychology. He's written about human agency. He's written about the science of psychology, and he's also really good at research methods and stats, and I can testify to that myself. My stats class from him, which was my introduction to him, was one of the funnest classes I ever took. I walked out smiling every day, which is not what I expected out of a stats class. He's been a visiting faculty member at Duquesne and at Georgetown. His bachelor's is from BYU. He graduated summa cum laude here and then did a master's and a PhD at Purdue University. He and his wife Camille have 5 children and 21 grandchildren. And please join me in welcoming Richard Williams.
Thank you, Emily, and I want to express appreciation for all of you who've taken time out to be here this afternoon. I know that you have other things that you could do. I hope that this will be worth the time that we spend together. Perhaps the most obvious and impressive effect of science in contemporary culture is the technology that science has produced. On most accounts, technology and what it has produced are positive. However, it has also created some dramatic and some subtle shifts in how we live and what we think and what things mean to us. Some technologies can even create moral issues that would not exist if it weren't for the technology itself. Examples include decisions as to whether to prolong life or terminate life before birth, by means of technology. The important point is that technology and therefore the science underlying the technology have significant effects on the meaning and the morality of our lives. Thus, both science and how we understand it have real effects on many aspects of our lives, even though we do not usually think about science in just this way. This introduction is not meant to focus attention on technology, however. Rather, the intent is to introduce a much broader issue: how it is that intellectual endeavors, including metaphysical assumptions, find their way into cultures and into individual lives. The effect of technology is only a model of that process, a process that is more subtle than it may seem. In his essay entitled The Problem Concerning Technology, Martin Heidegger writes about the effect of modern technology and how we understand ourselves and our lives. Heidegger proposes that the threat to man does not come in the first instance from the potentially lethal machines and apparatus of technology. The actual threat has already afflicted man in his essence. The rule of inframing threatens man with the possibility that it could be denied to him to enter into a more original revealing, and hence to experience the call of a more primal truth. End of quote. Heidegger here expresses the concern of many that successful, effective technology subtly invites us to entertain the possibility that all problems, including distinctly human problems, are merely technological problems. Technology is the ultimate pragmatism, and in a world dominated by technology and intoxicated by technological solutions to practical problems, everything is viewed as, quote, standing in reserve, ready to be used by or subjected to some form of technology or technological process. Human problems are regarded as if they were analogous to technological problems. Solutions are sought that consist chiefly in introducing a change agent into the closed causal system of the entity or machine that has gone wrong. In such a world, it is almost irresistible to enframe or perceive ourselves as subject to technological problems or waiting for technological solutions to our problems and technological enhancements to our lives. It is as if technology has become the sweeping metaphor of our age. It is not a stretch to suggest that our modern age really is, in some important sense, the age of science. Success at manipulating the world as technology provides strengthens our sense that science is what really is the case, that science is showing us what really is the case in this world that we inhabit. This essay is about the effects of some ways of thinking about science, what it is and what it can do. A particularly problematic way of understanding science has been described as scientism. Scientism is an enframing of life and world that has generated such enthusiasm and enjoyed such popularity that it often receives unquestioned acceptance by scholars and the public. Partly because scientism has become the new orthodoxy, understanding the implications of enframing ourselves and our world in the way that scientific thinkers do is a matter of great significance and consequence. However, it is crucial to distinguish between science and scientism. I'll attempt to show here why it is important to clarify the distinctions and challenge the ideas that undergird scientism and defend science from misappropriation. The concerns expressed by many about the effects of technology on culture, human life, and even on our understanding of ourselves are mirrored by substantive concerns about the effects of over-reliance on and overconfidence in science as the source of knowledge regarding all aspects of human life and ultimately all human problems. This overconfidence and over-reliance is the starting point for understanding scientism. It must be made clear at the outset, however, that to express a concern about or to criticize over-reliance on and overconfidence in science is not to oppose science or to diminish its accomplishments. Indeed, as it will be argued, scientism itself does no good service to science, qua science. Rather, it attempts to hijack science to support metaphysical commitments in which science has no particular interest and to which it owes no particular debt. While science and scientism share an intellectual heritage, scientism has taken a turn toward an ideology that goes well beyond what science itself requires, and in directions that may not facilitate the open, exploratory, expansive nature of science. Scientism entails a zealous metaphysical commitment and a requisite orthodoxy in method and in thought regarding the nature of the world and how understanding of the world is to be approached. Thus, the title of this essay speaks of scientism as the new orthodoxy. It is important to keep in mind that criticism of scientism is not criticism of science. Scientism, like science, certainly reflects the Enlightenment thought, but its contemporary purveyors seem to have forgotten or ignored something many of their most illustrious intellectual forebears from the Enlightenment period understood. It is that even as they rejected and went beyond mere metaphysical speculation, they understood that they could not escape the questions that had been at the heart of metaphysics. Reductive materialists, for example, have tried to escape metaphysics in virtually every age. However, reductive materialism is a response to the metaphysical question and is thus equally a metaphysics. It does not do away with the metaphysical project. The point is that scientism entails a metaphysical commitment to naturalist, either reductive or emergent naturalism, and tries to define science in a way that includes not only a commitment to empirical methods, but also to this particular metaphysic. Within scientism, then, questions are framed in terms of this particular metaphysical perspective, and the propriety of any method is evaluated primarily in terms of whether it deals with the world as if it really is, as naturalist, materialist metaphysics claim it is. Therefore, a scientistic science can only produce results compatible with or affirming of the same metaphysical commitment it started with, since the validity of the metaphysics itself is not a question that can be answered scientifically. This strategy is, however, not science. Within an intellectual regime of scientism, science is caught in a sort of Kuhnian paradigmatic phase with no revolutions in sight, no revolutions imaginable. In critically assessing scientism, then, it is important to understand that what science really requires and what it does not require. It would be non-controversial to say that science assumes and requires that the world be rational. That is, that it can be made sense of by a rational mind. The world must be orderly rather than random. There is no reason, however, that science should require that the rationality and order derive from or have their roots in any particular sort of reality. Whether order inheres in the nature of the world and things within it, or order is a reflection of laws working on brute material, the fundamental empirical approach of science should work equally well. There is certainly no obvious reason to believe that the metaphysical commitments of any particular scientist or of an entire school of them should affect science as an enterprise of empirical investigation or the conduct of science itself, so long as the scientists adhere to properly designated methodological standards and they craft their methods to be appropriate to whatever they think the world is like. One might wonder, perhaps, just which research laboratories would have to close down if it happened to be the case that Darwin got it wrong, or that there is a God. Metaphysics will affect what questions scientists choose to research. It will also affect how specific methodological procedures are crafted. It will also affect the theories scientists propose as explanations of what the methods of the science produce. However, it should not affect the science as science in its epistemological project. That is, simply discovering and reporting empirical facts. Furthermore, and I know empirical facts are interpretive, but still in all, the metaphysics should not dictate that. Furthermore, science will be most productive if the metaphysical commitments of the scientists actually conform to the nature of reality. However, science and its fundamental empirical approach are metaphysically impartial and uncommitted. Science does not require that naturalist, materialist metaphysics be true in order to proceed in its project of gathering and reporting empirical findings. And I'm using empirical findings in the broad sense here. The fact that scientific methods are crafted to probe and pursue certain phenomena in ways appropriate to the presumed nature of the phenomena means that science will be more or less effective in answering questions about the world, more or less impressive in the results of its products, and more or less truthful in its explanations of if it is operating under a set of metaphysical assumptions that really are true of the world. It is important to get the metaphysics right in order for the results of science to be reflective of truth. But science as science could operate perfectly well given any number of metaphysical truths. Aristotle reminds us that in our reasonings we can achieve such clearness as the subject matter admits, for it would be wrong to expect the same degree of accuracy in all reasonings. End of quote. However, it is not the nature of the world and its phenomena that determine whether science is possible, nor does science require that the world have any particular nature. Paul Feyerabend reminds us that the rigid metaphysical requirements inherent to scientism are not required by science. To quote Feyerabend, is science the best type of knowledge we possess, or is it just the most influential? This way of putting the question has by now become obsolete. Science is not one thing, it is many. It is not closed, but open to new approaches. Objections to novelty and to alternatives come from particular groups with vested interest, not from science as a whole. Science, then, is not tied to or dependent upon any particular metaphysical reality. Scientism, on the other hand, is not just a straightforward confidence in a generic science. It is a metaphysical commitment. Bastian von Frassen has described how thinkers committed to materialist metaphysics have tried over the centuries to subsume empiricism and consequently science as well. Contemporary scientism is the latest such attempt. To resist this hostile takeover is to defend science. While the term scientism is not widely used even in scholarly discourse, there are a number of readily available definitions that, when taken together, convey what is intended by the word. They also allow us to focus on the intellectual issues at the foundation of scientism that are of sufficient importance to inspire orthodoxy in some scholars and critique in others. Across various definitions, 4 principal aspects of scientism can be distilled. The various definitions differ in terms of which of these aspects of the construct they emphasize. All definitions make claims and rest on assumptions about the nature of science and about the nature of knowledge claims that can be made in the name of science. The definitions also uniformly, without explicitly acknowledging doing so, take science to be a particular specifiable epistemological endeavor wedded to a particular supporting metaphysics, descended in a direct line from the period of the Enlightenment. Now, the 4 common definitions of scientism, then, can be described in terms of the following tenets, which you see up there. It is a tenet of scientism that only certifiably scientific knowledge counts as real knowledge. All else is mere opinion or nonsense. Scientific knowledge is defined in terms of the method by which it is obtained. Scientism, therefore, must also hold that there is a certifiable and specifiable method, or at least a manageable set of such methods, that counts as scientific. More sophisticated purveyors of scientism will allow that there is not a single scientific method, but nevertheless, there will be a common core at the heart of all surface-level methods that constitute science. It should be noted here that underlying this claim about scientific method, there's another assumption, that the world just is, metaphysically, of a nature that yields itself to such methods and not to others, thus making scientific methods not only legitimate, but necessary for real knowledge. Number 2, if the first tenet holds, then a second tenet follows unproblematically. It is that the methods and assumptions underlying the natural sciences, including epistemological and metaphysical doctrines, are appropriate for all sciences, including prominently the social and human sciences. A corollary doctrine is that the arts, if they seek to be more than myth and self-expression, must somehow be brought under the umbrella of science. If they cannot be brought under the umbrella of science, perhaps a rapprochement can be achieved, the terms of which shall be dictated by science. Number 3, this attitude toward the arts and the softer sciences illuminates a third tenet of scientism. Scientism exudes and promotes an exaggerated confidence in science, that is, natural science in all its avatars, to produce knowledge and to solve the problems facing humanity. Such confidence would be reasonable only if the world, in every aspect of reality, were of a nature that lends itself to study by a science conceived and constructed as our current natural science is, and that yields knowledge to such methods as we have constructed for our current natural sciences to use. In this confidence, we are again made aware that scientism makes assumptions about the nature of reality that are metaphysical in nature. And number 4, the fourth tenet articulates the hereto implicit assumptions underlying the other 3. Scientism is not just an attitude about science and the power of science. Scientism makes metaphysical claims, sometimes hidden and sometimes not. Among the claims of scientism is that the world must really be like the methods of contemporary natural science assume it to be. Otherwise, claims of legitimacy and power of science would be without grounds. Just as the science of scientism has come through intellectual history fairly intact from the Enlightenment period, so has the metaphysics of scientism. Scientism assumes and requires a naturalist, materialist, rather mechanistic metaphysic. Such a metaphysic is so important to scientism that it has become a core feature of the orthodoxy of scientism. Commitment to this metaphysics is preeminent among the ideas that give energy to defenders and promulgators of scientism. It is scientism's insistence on naturalist, materialist, metaphysical orthodoxy that is of most concern to many of its thoughtful critics. Overconfidence in science might be dismissed as largely harmless, youthful exuberance. Dismissal of the arts and humanities and what they reveal about us might be tolerated as narrow-minded, but understandable on the part of scientifically minded scholars. Prescribing for the social sciences the methods and assumptions of the natural sciences might even be seen as a historical reoccurrence of the ill-fated overconfidence of the logical positivists, one which must be merely outlived again and again, it seems. The intellectual opportunity costs of hammering away at problems in the human sciences with methods not developed or well adapted to deal with them might of themselves be sufficient to question and even reject scientism in the social sciences. However, the metaphysical claims on which scientism is based have significant consequences that reach beyond those just mentioned. When this naturalist, materialist, mechanical metaphysics that has been somewhat pragmatically useful in the natural sciences and that seems relatively compatible with the natural world is applied to the human world, the result is a fundamental alteration of our understanding of our nature and ourselves. The very meaning of what it means to be a human being, our lives and our actions, the possibility of morality and the essence of our human relatedness are all called into question. This is because under the intellectual regime of scientism, to understand these fundamental aspects of our humanity is to explain them in terms of things outside them. And to explain them in that way is to destroy them. This problematic tension between reductive, naturalistic explanation and the understanding and preservation of our humanity is probably most clearly visible in the interface of science, as scientism understands it, and religion. However, the tension is present throughout contemporary culture. Of concern to many in various intellectual traditions is the fact that the metaphysics of scientism is being enforced in cultural and intellectual discourse by purveyors often lacking adequate training in metaphysics or even the philosophy of science. This is surely true within the social sciences and the humanities and even the hard sciences. Most scientists, as scientists, are not trained in metaphysics. They simply inherit it from the intellectual culture in which they learn and practice their craft. Thus, as scientism invades and co-opts intellectual and cultural discourse, as, for example, in the popular rhetoric of the so-called new atheists, It brings with it a set of assumptions and implications that are portentous in terms of their effect on not only our scientific, but also our moral, political, and aspirational discourse. The effect of scientism is the same as what Daniel Dennett described as the effect of Darwinism, as a universal intellectual acid that eats through everything, leaving everything somewhat recognizable but fundamentally changed. What is at stake as scientism becomes the new orthodoxy is our humanity itself. There's no question regarding the philosophical and methodological roots of modern science. It is the product of that period of intellectual history known as the Enlightenment. For some scholars, the Enlightenment consisted essentially of the rise of science and the demise of speculative metaphysics. This attitude can tend to portray the history of ideas and consequently of culture as on a smooth upward trajectory, impeded only by reactionary persons and ideas that either cling to older metaphysical systems and cosmologies or who have doubts about the power of rationality and empirical science to uncover the true nature of the world and how it works. This progressive enthusiasm is a key characteristic of scientism. For those riding the crest of the presumed wave of progress, even if one particular science is not complete, science itself is complete, or will be. Other scholars understand our intellectual history and the current state of the world of ideas to be more complex and nuanced than this. This moderated enthusiasm comes not only from what have come to be known as postmodern perspectives, but also based on careful and rigorous understanding of the roots of what are taken to be Enlightenment ideas and the assumptions and implications in which they are embedded. While scientism and its enthusiasts regard science as the next, perhaps final progressive step away from speculative metaphysics and epistemology to simple factual truth, other scholars recognize that science cannot replace metaphysics or epistemology. While science may bring to light facts and phenomena, it will always be the case that these must be interpretively understood and accounted for. That is, facts, even scientific ones, always require interpretation. There will always be a metaphysical project accompanying a scientific one. Thus, there is constant need for good metaphysics and sound epistemology. In his excellent History of the Enlightenment, Louis Dupré summarizes two widely recognized concepts underlying the revolutionary thought of the period. The first was rationalism in two senses. One, a confidence in a priori processes of the mind as essential to knowledge and understanding, and a more radical sense that the mind was the sole source of truth and thus of authority in matters of knowledge. The second concept was emancipation, by which was meant freeing humankind from the consequences of believing in anything other than what can be derived from reason. In fact, Dupré suggests the modern turn in philosophy involved an understanding that reality was no longer intrinsically intelligible by its nature. Rather, intelligibility was a product of the human mind imposed upon the world. This philosophical turn contributed to a view of the universe as mechanical and impersonal. While such a universe was orderly and the order was imposed or captured by the mind, there was no higher order, no purpose or reality reflected in that order. This understanding of reality constituted the break of philosophy and science from the classical scholastic intellectual traditions. Of course, a fundamental change in our understanding of the nature of reason necessarily entails a fundamental change in our understanding of the reasoner, that is, in the human being. Dupré explains, two consequences followed from the transformation of reason. One, the subject, now sole source of meaning, lost all objective content of its own and became a mere instrument for endowing an equally empty nature with a rational structure. 2, since reality thereby lost the inherent intelligibility it had possessed for the ancients and the schoolmen, the nature of theoria fundamentally changed. Thinking ceased to consist of perceiving the nature of the real. It came to consist of forcing reality to answer the subject's questions. Contemplation became an instrument in the hands of and for the benefit of an all-powerful subject, end quote. More particularly relevant for our understanding of the development of science and scientism, Dupre observed that Enlightenment thinkers imposed on reality the rules of the one science that the mind could indeed claim full authorship of, and which depended on no external content, namely mathematics. The mind thereby acquired an unprecedented control over nature, yet it ceased to be an integral part of it, end quote. Control over nature as the principal legitimizing goal of science and reason was a chief impetus for the turn toward the empiricism that informed the work of, for example, Francis Bacon and others, and has been at the heart of scientific method and in some form at the heart of the epistemological commitment of most scientists ever since. Scientism, as it has emerged and as it runs through contemporary thought, reflects commitment to a set of constructs and ideas with roots in Enlightenment thought. Not all of these, of course, will be found in every scientific expression or sentiment. Scientism is, in its basic form, a dogmatic overconfidence in science and scientific knowledge. But more importantly, it is overconfidence in science defined by, constructed around, and requiring that the world must be made up of physical matter, following particular lawful principles, and that all phenomena are essentially thus constituted. This gives scholars the great confidence that characterizes scientism. The confidence associated with this worldview is seen in the insistence that any scholarly endeavor that does not ground itself in that required set of constructs and ideas must be rejected as unscientific, and any knowledge claims made as a result of such endeavors are suspect. Such knowledge claims are to be rejected as being only metaphysical speculation, reflecting mere subjective bias, or ironically, a devotion to religious orthodoxy. Orthodoxy is the irony. The set of ideas that characterizes scientism as opposed to science qua science is fairly easy to specify and to identify as having roots, again, in Enlightenment thinking. Scientism entails the acceptance of a particular, quite literal reading of what has come to be called Cartesian dualism, meaning that the world is assumed by scientism to consist of two realms: the powerful mind that produces knowledge by the processes of the rational intellect, and the realm of extended matter, that is, physical material. Scientism entails acceptance, therefore, of the proposition that there is no rational order inherent in the world itself, that is, as part of its nature and status in a larger, meaningful whole. There is an order to things and events, but an order governed by the external laws that determine the behavior of matter from the outside and or reflect how the rational mind works. For scientism, this lawful order is manifest in cause-effect relationships and in particular kinds of hard determinism. Knowledge, as pursued within scientism, does not reflect harmony with the order inherent in the world. Understanding is not of the order present in the nature of things, but rather of the laws that operate on things. Knowledge offers not harmony and enlightenment, but explanation and power. Scientism holds that absent a fundamental order inherent in the world, there is likewise no telos in the world. This means that for all things and events, causality must be understood as imposition or impetus coming from outside, not from within. In the human world, commitment to this principle obviates freedom of the will and any meaningful human agency. In the human, as well as the non-human world, causality is only understood as a particular kind of efficient cause imposed from the outside. The fundamental example of this sort of efficient cause is to be found in mechanism. Scientism thus entails a commitment to mechanism. Most technology consists of, relies upon sophisticated mechanism. Because of this commitment to mechanism, scientism tends to view all problems as, in some sense, technological problems. They result from lawful malfunction and are dealt with by interventions into the mechanism. When mechanistic technological models are applied to human behavior, people become not actors, but stages on which or within which actions occur. For scientism, with its intellectual commitment to a world in which only minds and matter, and perhaps laws, can be considered real, there is no need, or perhaps even no sense, in positing the existence of anything other than matter. Matter operates according to laws, and mind imposes meaning on such operations. Thus, materialism is the metaphysics of scientism, and metaphysics is really just physics. The materialist reduction will be complete when mind itself can be definitively shown to be just operations of the matter of the brain. Scientism rejects most meaningful kinds of transcendence. If materialism captures the essence of reality in terms of matter and law, and if physics is complete, there is no need for, or indeed no place for, transcendence. The only transcendence is found in the limited creative operations of the rational mind. And the mind itself is emergent from matter and mired in material circumstance. It follows from this that within a scientistic intellectual regime, there are no transcendent ethical principles or realities. Moral relativism and deontological ethics are without substance. Moral realism and deontological ethics are without substance or foundation. The most sophisticated ethical systems that can be formulated or justified within a scientistic intellectual regime will be derived entirely from rational considerations and grounded in utilitarian concerns and social contracts. It must be acknowledged that the foregoing is not an exhaustive roster of intellectual commitments constitutive of scientism. It does, however, lay out some intellectual and moral implications of some of the commitments, which often form the basis of scholarly critiques of scientism. Some scholars critique scientism because it's bad science and bad philosophy, while others reject it because of its bad anthropology and bad moral theory. Still others criticize it because it is bad for us as the kind of beings we are, and bad because it cannot provide a foundation for a good and flourishing life for the kind of beings we are, morally or politically. We want to talk next for a minute about the presumptions of scientism. A criticism of something called scientism is an unusual endeavor. Scientism is not like any other intellectual position in that in some cases they end up as schools. They're largely consensual tenets of them that everyone agrees upon, and at least a roughly identifiable set of adherents who will allow themselves to be referred to as such. In the case of scientism, those who might be identified as adherents most often repudiate the term, and in many ways deny there is such a thing as scientism. For them, the very idea of scientism is merely an uninformed and unfounded criticism of the intellectual product of science itself. So the critique of scientism articulated here is aimed at a way of thinking, a set of problematic assumptions, while those who may think that way or make those assumptions may reject the very concept of scientism. Nonetheless, the issues articulated here are very important ones to raise with regard to an intellectual position that is emerging and has become for many the new orthodoxy. An article by Professor Steven Pinker serves as an example of how an adherent and popularizer of scientism rejects the very term scientism as used by critics. He's proud to adopt it for himself, but rejects and criticizes those who level it as a criticism. He sloughs off the criticisms leveled against scientism and then invokes the very kind of thinking that has prompted the criticisms. Pinker first claims that nearly all great thinkers as scientists, then assures his readers that science pursues intelligibility and not reductionism, and concludes that science, as he describes it, provides the best foundation for belief, morality, and essentially all human endeavors. Pinker's article also, however, embodies the presumptions and intellectual commitments that have led thoughtful people to identify and critique scientism in the first place. He begins by claiming René Descartes, Baruch Spinoza, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, David Hume, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Gottfried Wilhelm von Leibniz, Immanuel Kant, and Adam Smith as fellow scientists. A thoughtful reader must wonder what definition of scientist is so broad as to meaningfully capture such a diverse array of great thinkers. This claim is clearly a linguistic maneuver, a strategy of arguing by seizing the definition of the term science, as proponents of scientism are wont to do. Thus, Pinker claims by definition that science engulfs all good and careful thinking, implying thereby that there really are no important intellectual projects outside the province of science. This is, however, a useless definition. If science really is all good thought, then science is not distinguishable from any other worthwhile intellectual endeavor, and it contrasts only with that which is deemed nonsense. But these are precisely the questions that are at issue. It leaves unanswered how one is to decide what is nonsense. If Pinker answers, as I am sure he would, that one decides by scientific method, then the circular argument reaches full closure. Pinker clearly does, however, have in mind a more particular understanding of science. On the other hand, a critic of scientism might point out that if all scientists were as educated, skilled, and insightful in metaphysics, moral philosophy, the philosophy of mind, mathematics, aesthetics, and epistemology as his eminent lists of scientists that Pinker mentions, then there would possibly be no scientism of the sort that's caused this type of deep concern in the first place. It is apparent by Pinker's own writing, however, that not all contemporary scientists rise to the level of those he mentions. In dismissing the contemporary concerns that have arisen about scientism, Pinker provides a pragmatic example of those very concerns. As you can see the quote, "Of science," he writes, "to begin with, the findings of science entail that the belief systems of all the world's traditional religions and cultures, their theories of the origins of life, humans, and societies are factually mistaken. We know, but our ancestors did not, that humans belong to a single species of African primate that developed agriculture, government, and writing late in its history. We know that the species is a tiny twig of a genealogical tree that embraces all living things that emerged from prebiotic chemicals almost 4 billion years ago. We know that the laws governing the physical world, including accident, disease, and other misfortunes, have no goals that pertain to human well-being. There is no such thing as fate, providence, karma, spells, curses, augury, divine retribution, or answered prayers. Though the discrepancy between the laws of probability and the workings of cognition may explain why people believe there are," end quote. Now, I put the italics in there on the word "no." Pinker goes on to report that, quote, "the worldview that guides the moral and spiritual values of an educated person today is the worldview given us by science." End quote. To this, Pinker adds, quote, "the facts of science, by exposing the absence of purpose in the laws governing the universe, force us to take responsibility for the welfare of ourselves, our species, and our planet. For the same reason, they undercut any moral or political system based on mystical forces, quests, destinies, dialectics, struggles, or messianic ages," end quote. The foundation of our morality in this scientific age is that, quote, We are social beings who impinge on each other and can negotiate codes of conduct that maximize the flourishing of humans and other sentient beings, end quote. That Pinker's conclusions about what we know from this quote might not be derivable from science itself is suggested by how closely his conclusions about the origin, nature, destiny, and meaninglessness of human life follow those reached by Bertrand Russell as early as 1903 in his proclamation, The Free Man's Worship. Professor Russell, notably absent from Pinker's list of scientists, did not have the benefit of a century of scientific process in reaching these same conclusions about the nature of the world, including all humanity. A skeptic begins to suspect here at this point that Pinker's declarations, like Russell's, are not really scientific but conjectural and reflect a kind of intellectual orthodoxy. They arise from shared metaphysical, epistemological, and moral commitments and are not the necessary conclusions of scientific endeavor. In fact, as an oft-quoted statement from Richard Lewontin suggests, it is not the methods and institution of science, it is not that the methods and institution of science somehow compel us to accept the material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. The need for a critical examination of scientism is articulated by philosopher and author Marilynne Robinson when she writes of what she calls parascientific literature. It describes it as a robust and surprisingly conventional genre of social or political theory or anthropology that makes its case by proceeding using the science of its moment, from a genesis of human nature and primordial life to a set of general conclusions about what our nature is and must be, together with the ethical, political, economic, and/or philosophic implications to be drawn from these conclusions. One of the characterizing traits of this large and burgeoning literature is its confidence that science has given us knowledge sufficient to allow us to answer certain essential questions about the nature of reality, if only by dismissing them. What is at stake in the tension between scientism and the science it seeks to dominate, as well as the understandings it seeks to replace, is our very humanity, the nature of our existence, the meaning of our lives, and our understanding of the best to which we can aspire. Noted philosopher Thomas Nagel points to the intellectual path that must be followed if we are to benefit from science in understanding the world and our place in it. Commenting on, quote, the implausibility of the reductive program, end quote, that is a key assumption of scientism, Nagel notes, quote, if we want to try and understand the world as a whole, then we must start with an adequate range of data, and those data must include the evident facts about ourselves, end quote. Rather than overriding the data available to us by and through our very humanity, we need to take account of what our own lived experience as the kind of beings we are tells us about life and the world. Objections by many scholars notwithstanding, there is a discernible and identifiable family of intellectual positions having the clear and unmistakable characteristics that may be referred to as scientism. The constellation of ideas, assumptions, and conclusions are well known and easily identified, and perhaps to an alarming degree become the worldview that guides the moral and spiritual values of an educated person today. That's a quote from Pinker. In other words, it has become the new orthodoxy. One might view any concern about scientism to be just an intellectual disagreement, perhaps the latest phase of confirmation of materialist naturalism and those who find it unconvincing. There is, however, something new in the current ascent of scientism that lends greater significance to the discussion. Scientism seeks to claim the authority of science as validation of its metaphysics. In so doing, opposing views are cast not only as mistaken, but as making no sense, since scientific knowledge is held to be the only real knowledge that can make sense. This renders much of what human beings think about themselves and much that they believe meaningless because nonsensible. It is of this, all of this has the potential to affect our view of our own human nature, such that we see ourselves as mere natural organisms. The extension of the influence of scientism into the human sciences, the humanities, and even religion calls into question all transcendence, along with trans-situational values and morality generally, offering in return only a severely impoverished, strictly utilitarian moral landscape. In light of these implications, scientism as the new orthodoxy inevitably raises intellectual concerns and scholarly discourse to a level higher than mere intellectual squabble. In an important sense, what is at stake in the issue of scientism is the intellectual integrity of the social sciences and the soul of humankind. What will we understand ourselves to be? Thank you.
Well, to me, one of the core problems of scientism is they take a principle such as natural selection or global warming and then extrapolate from it ethical guidelines that aren't necessarily inherent with the principle of either of those. I mean, there is no ethics in natural selection, but ethics has been derived from natural selection. Right. I mean, do you feel there's a way to point that out clearly or to just show the disconnect between the scientific principle and the ethics derived from the principle?
I think you just did. I mean, it's an easy thing to show that to a person with an open mind. It's not as easy to show that to a person whose intellectual commitments have sunk to the level of sort of informing their intellectual life and their understanding of things. I've tried to do this a number of ways over the years. You first have to get their attention. One of the things that has been sort of maybe disingenuous but fun is in terms of natural selection. You say, so natural selection, is it embodied or unembodied? Well, it's embodied. Does it work only in a few places or everywhere? Everywhere. Can you see it? No, you can't see it. Is it responsible for everything? Yeah, it's responsible for everything. And then the response is, you mean like God? It's that they are producing an ethic, as you say. And I don't know how to make that clear. There are sources that say, there are no ethical implications for this, and there are other sources that talk about the obvious ethical implications of these positions that have been drawn from them. I just think we have to keep saying it again and again and again, and using examples, trying to get their attention in one way or another.
Thank you. So I think one of the challenges here and one of the risks is that we sort of run the risk of sort of two approaches to the sort of production and the dissemination of knowledge. One is traditional science, and one is this critique of scientism. And so one of the critiques of scientism is that what you said, an exaggerated confidence in science to produce knowledge and solve human problems. And there are plenty of social problems, right? I mean, violence. Elder Holland just talked about intergenerational poverty in General Conference. I study educational inequality, family disintegration, and the list goes on. So my question is, how do we sort of frame more of a complementary approach rather than, sort of the critique of scientism versus science, but more of a sort of how do we articulate a complementary approach to the production and dissemination of knowledge in a way that we can solve these problems that are real?
Well, I don't think we want to develop a complementary approach to scientism or with scientism. With science, yes, we do. And in the minds of all the best scientists I know, that's not an issue. There's no reason why these problems can't be studied by certifiably appropriate scientific methods. Demographers do it all the time, for example. I was taught by a man who the bottom line for him was, he was a theorist, a remarkably good theorist, and he says at the end of the day, you put up or shut up by doing an empirical demonstration. There's nothing wrong with that, in my opinion. The problem comes when, A, people insist on only a certifiably scientific method can reveal anything of worth, and B, that scientific method demands that we assume, both at the level of the instigation of the investigation and at the level of the explanations of results, that materialist, naturalist metaphysics are in place. That's what we have to fight. The problem that you articulate is a real one, but it would go away if we could save science from scientism and from the assumption that science requires a particular metaphysic. It doesn't. Any method that we make as scientists will be better at some things, worse than others, but it doesn't require that the world be any particular way except observable, rational, and orderly. That's it. Whether God did it or causal rays from Venus, it doesn't matter as far as the science is concerned. I don't know if that helps, but the issue, the seeming conflict is a product of scientism, not science. So we save science, we shake the dust off. I know in my own discipline of psychology, most of us who are upset about this end up saying, I just had to turn away from science. No, we don't want to turn away from science. We want to save science. We're trying to it's being kidnapped. And we want to stop that, bring it in, take advantage of its virtues, and not allow it to take this form of scientism. Ralph?
Yeah, I'll try to speak up. I won't.
Okay.
It's too far to walk over there. I think you're right to try to save this complementarity and to drive a wedge between science and scientism. But I wonder, and maybe this would be necessary for your rhetorical purposes, if you're not underestimating the challenge or how strong a tendency is for them, for scientism to stick to science. I mean, I like, at its root, science just means knowledge. So you're right in principle that it shouldn't imply any a priori commitment to one methodology or one metaphysic or another. But the whole story you told, going back to the Enlightenment, and one could go back a century or two earlier, and the whole story you told shows that, and your reference to Heidegger as well, suggests that this commitment or the scientific tendencies of science are not accidental. In fact, they're ingrained in the whole pragmatic machinery and the social machinery, the political grounding. What everybody thinks science is for, namely to solve problems. And science is about looking at the world as a problem to be solved. And if I had the time that I won't take, I would say, think about how this applies to studying humanity in the family, for example, in an experimental problem-solving mode, which is simply to get out of that mode would require taking seriously commitments, philosophical, religious, drawing from literature like Marilynne, for example, that would be hard to fit into anybody's conception of modern science as very much a going concern with lots of power behind it. I meant to preface that by saying, excellent presentation. I just wonder if we need to make the difficulty of the project.
That's the first time in my life I've ever been accused of being Pollyanna. Ever. Your point is well taken. I just don't think we have a choice. You can't give up science. The only choice we have is to be clear about what it is and what it isn't, call metaphysics what it is, and just keep pressing this understanding. And you start with the generation of students, not with the old people who've invested, like me, who've invested so many years in one form or the other. I'm not optimistic, but I don't think there is a viable option. I'm sort of a liberal when it comes to science. I think you can use certifiably scientific method. If you shake the metaphysics off of it, you can use certifiably scientific methods for answering questions, as long as you keep in mind the limitations on what you think you learned and what you think it means, and any suggestion that this was the best way to do it, that all else is just the parlor where you entertain people before you go back and do the real work of science. We have to become more sophisticated. If we don't, there is no way to win. We lose science, and it doesn't help us.
Don't make me out, by the way, as against science.
No, I know.
Dictionary
Yeah.
meaning. I'm not a postmodern to that.
Right, yeah.
I'm in favor of science and reason, but I think what you're saying implies, but by shaking off the scientism would really mean that science would have to be answerable to, or at least respectful of, educational purposes, which it does not command. Now we're talking about the shape of the university.
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, I'd have to think that through carefully, but it seems to me all we have to claim is that science is an approach to studying the world and things in it and answering questions that agrees to limit itself to what is experienceable, with machines or without machines, visually or in some other way.
Why is it good, and why should we make the students do it? Why is it good?
Well, it makes airplanes stay up while they're flying, and bridges don't collapse, and but not merely technological reasons. Here's an example. I used to, sometimes when I would grade essays or something like that, a student would write an essay and I'd give it an A, B, C, or D, and I just wanted to check myself to see I wonder if I'm being all soft and squishy about this. So I assigned them numbers, and I thought, no, that can't be right. It can tell us some stuff that we would otherwise overlook. And some questions that are important really are. Demographers, for example, give us really, really good information that none of us is in a position to know. Without going out, asking the questions, seeing what people say and do. There are some wonderful things that it can do that have consequences for our understanding of ourselves and what we're doing. So I don't want to dismiss it. I want to return it to its metaphysical innocence and use it where we can.
I think we agree basically that maybe except on the possibility of this innocence.
Well, it requires that the scientists have a clear understanding of this whole issue and integrity, not to go beyond what he's doing. I dug a ditch with my shovel. I'm not going to pawn it off as something other than a ditch. That's what it is, and that's what my shovel allowed me to do. And so there you go. Now we got to get smart and still do the hard work of trying to understand what it means. Yes?
I won't use the same excuse. It's not too far of a walk. But first of all, thank you very much, Dr. Williams. I really appreciated all your words, and most recently you said something that sparked something in my mind, because I'm an undergraduate psychology student who has aspirations to go to graduate school in psychology. And although I see, a lot of the benefits of the technologies that have been the product of scientific research in various disciplines, one could easily argue that within what have often been called, the soft sciences, that science really hasn't produced technologies that justify, as you kind of, or as has been in the conversation, to continue to use science as an epistemology. And so I get frustrated, I'm LDS, I'm here at an LDS school, and I feel like there's only a minority of voices, even here at BYU, that are trying to express an alternative to science. I feel like I'm one of those students that is being forced, to do methods that don't really align with what I feel like God would have me do if, I were really trying to be a humble truth seeker. And I guess there's 100 questions in what I'm trying to say. But
Well, come and see me, and we'll take them one at a time.
But ultimately, if there aren't really any justifiable technologies in the softer sciences, why isn't there more of a push for alternatives? Are they just not there, or are we not?
Well, I think scientism is the answer to that question. I don't know whether we want to use the word all,
Sure,
but,
so
but
that's my point.
scientism is the answer to that question. I think what I would hope happens is that people such as yourself, who have those same kinds of feelings, will not reject science, but will redeem it. That's what we need to do. We need to redeem science and recognize it for what it is and put a stop to the illegitimate uses and the illegitimate conclusions. We just got to be smarter than they are. And how one does that, one continues to make noise and write papers that people don't like and try to get things in print that people don't want to read. And then you teach other students. And again, I'm a sort of a methodological liberal. In my early career, I used to do empirical scientific studies just in order to find things that made life uncomfortable for the people that I disagreed with. So you can use the method for any purpose you want, even to show that those scientific findings and theories are absolutely refutable by the terms of observation, on the basis of observations and scientific methods. So the method is not a problem. I don't know if Steve Yancher's here. He and I fight at least an hour a year on this back and forth. I don't find any harm in the method. Is it sometimes stupid? Yeah, it's stupid. Does it answer the most important question? No, it doesn't answer the most important question. Can it ever show us something we might not otherwise see? Probably. So you just go ahead and do it, but all the time keeping in mind what you're not doing, illegitimate conclusions, and all of these things. It's believe me, I've only been at it 33 years. It's a tough battle to win. But the alternative is to just say, okay, yeah, they can have science, we'll do something else, and that won't get you anywhere. We have to go back and redeem science and say, whatever you think this isn't it. And as I say, one way is to beat the bounders at their own games and do the science better than they do with metaphysical constraint. Sir.
I like the definition of Charles Sanders Peirce about science, who defines it as basically a willingness to learn from one's mistakes, that whenever you discover you have made a mistake, you're going to correct it. Now, my question is, in your rejection of scientism, you don't want to reject science. You want to use the methodology, correctly so, of course. But to what extent, then, is it not possible to do science to prove scientism wrong, And is there not the possibility for those that you claim practice scientism, that they would say that you have people that want to just accept bad science, and that either your conclusions have to prove themselves in some way to be correct, and if you can do that, then I think over time the scientific community would have to accept those conclusions, and that science tends to reject those who don't want to put their conclusions to the test. If you want to claim there is more than matter and mind, you have to demonstrate it using the scientific method. So to what extent is your rejection of scientism simply what you would consider simply bad science, and that by doing better science you should be able to correct those mistakes?
Well, this reminds me, I once wrote an article talking about the inability of science to establish causality, to verify, to falsify. These are all philosophically tight positions. And the reviewer sent it back, rejected its publication, and said, when you have some data about these things, then we'll consider publishing your paper. And the topic of the paper was how data won't answer those kinds of questions. So the question, my objection is to scientism, not science, but here's the issue, and I think the way you set that up suggests maybe you're kind of understanding it this way. Scientism cannot be proven false by any certifiably scientific method, because what needs to be shown to be false are the metaphysical and epistemological conceits of scientism. There are no metaphysical propositions that I'm aware of that can be established by certifiably observable methods, by definition. No scientific method which relies on empirical experience is going to verify the truth or falsity, presence or absence of any particular metaphysical reality that may have produced it. This is Doom Quine. This is one of the oldest philosophical principles we know about. Those kinds of issues, the kind that will refute scientism, cannot be established by observable methods. Now, what scientism does then is doesn't bother to verify them, just invokes them, and that's why we call it an orthodoxy. It's a dogma. And so what is needed is better philosophy, not more observations. If it could be done scientifically, I would say that's great, but it can't by definition. And I take maybe a more optimistic view of science. Science is not merely a method. It is a knowledge claim. It is a type of knowledge, a type of knowing. And, for example, Galileo used some methods to find some things, but established them in mathematical terms. That scientific knowledge is not going to yield to any other kind of observation. That aspect of science, the taking of these observations and making something of them that has some kind of conceptual mathematical irrefutability, that's a part of science too. Are we going to achieve that in the human sciences? Probably never. But we're having this debate in our disciplines with people who don't understand clearly the nature of science. Sometimes I get involved with a neuroscientist, and some of the things I write, they say, well, you really need a neuroscientist to contribute that. And I say, yeah, and you need a philosopher, because you're talking about causality, and you haven't got a clue of what it means to make causal claims. So it's a matter of education, but what you're proposing, I think, just can't happen by definition, because scientism is not established by science itself. It's a set of fundamental, unprovable assertions about what science must be. It's a metaphysical issue, not an observational issue.
Just a small follow-up question. Why would someone who embraces scientism bother with the accusation if they cannot be proven wrong and there is no alternative way that actually will improve on their thinking and the ability to do science?
They won't. That's why I'm not likely to convert them. What I want to do is save the next generation. That's an easy life. Once you take an unfalsifiable position and it gets you money and fame, that's about the best academic gig I can think of. So no, they're not very convertible. They've got everything to lose and nothing to gain.
But why do you think they are wrong if you have no argument that shows in some way that they are wrong?
I'm not sure what you're asking. I think they're wrong because I have those arguments, and the arguments don't come from within the system that they are supporting. That is...
Oh, okay, but that means that you just have to use science and be productive and show something that with your presuppositions you can do.
No, not science, depending on what you mean by science. What you're saying is, you're making a critique of things that are not observable, so go get some observations that prove your critique is right. You can't do that. The problem is not a scientific problem. It's not a scientific question. No method of science can get any traction on whether or not the universe is as Plato says it was.
No, I'm not talking about observables. I am talking about things, commitments that do make the scientific method more productive, that ultimately enable you to explain something that otherwise cannot be explained. If you have no added explanatory value, it seems that any baggage claims seem to be meaningless. And so I am wondering, how can you show someone who embraces scientism the error of their ways?
Well, you can't by scientific terms.
You cannot. There has to be a way, right? There has to be a way.
No, I don't think there does. Not by scientific methods. I can explain it to them philosophically. I can do it logically. I can even do my own research and say this works too.
But I think philosophy is part of the scientific method.
It is. It's entirely derived from the scientific method. But the argument is empirical science cannot verify, cannot falsify, cannot establish causality, cannot verify theory. That's a dead issue in anyone who knows the philosophy of science. So the challenge of disproving something through scientific method is an illegitimate challenge. We better let somebody else have the microphone here, and then we got to quit in just a minute.
So as I understood in your presentation, you said that science, true science, perhaps we should say, relies on a commitment to the universe having an orderliness, but that science or scientism ends up in the end rejecting that orderliness.
No, I didn't mean to say that.
Oh,
That's not what I intended.
but you quoted Pinker, who says, well, there's no teleology or any of these.
That's
things.
right. So the scientism is going to say, yes, there is an orderliness, and it has to do entirely with the orderliness inherent in material things. In the medieval period, for example, the orderliness was God's created universe. It was an orderliness that everything we saw was sort of that, showed us that order in miniature. And so scientism and modern science certainly rejects that notion that that's the kind of order there is. Scientism certainly rejects that and says, yeah, there's an orderliness, but it is the orderliness of lawful lawfully guided matter. That's the only orderliness there is. There's no order imposed by God, no order imposed by nature, no order imposed by anything. It's just dumb, brute matter following dumb, brute law.
So would their orderliness then be, would they reject that it's an ontological orderliness, that it's only orderly relative to the way we see it, and therefore then they attach onto it?
That is probably the last of the really interesting issues that scientism can deal with, because since the Enlightenment, since Descartes, we've suggested it's the mind that orders the world, and that's what we see. And the other possibility is that, no, it's just matter obeying dumb, brute laws. And scientists, those proponents of scientism, want to accept rationality, because rationality is the foundation of the scientific method. They can't give that up, but they don't want there to be anything except brute matter doing what it lawfully has to do. Now the hope, the paradise for scientism is if we can show that these rational workings of the mind are just brain stuff. Then the victory's complete. So that's what they're hoping for. It's just that brute lawfulness of matter that has no higher order, no directing anything, no direction, no telos, just behaving as laws dictate that it behave. The chemicals unfold in certain ways, and therefore that's what happens. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Pardon? Yeah, I do. Okay. People may need to leave.
I'm a history major, so tread lightly, but it seems like if you go down that path of trying to define science, you're going to get it wrong somehow. And maybe, I don't know, maybe that is kind of scientism, the vein of scientism. But are there people within that vein that kind of look back and say, yeah, we've got something wrong? Is there any dialogue among scientists in this vein? Does that make sense?
Yeah, there is, or I know I wouldn't have written this. We've got a book coming out on this topic. There is an intellectual discourse about this. But the title of my presentation and the title of the book is Scientism, the New Orthodoxy. A lot of the essays argue that this metaphysical commitment is held by people with the same kind of passion that you get fundamentalist religions or Marxists or something. That world has to be this way. The worst example of that would be some of the so-called new atheists. If you read the stuff that they do, I mean, those are diatribes. There is some backing and forthing going on, but because this, in my judgment, is a sect. Okay, there's emotion attached to this. There are some people who just won't engage in the dialogue. What we can hope to do is educate ourselves and our colleagues so that they don't get further and further. Right now, scientism represents an increasingly large majority of people who call themselves scientists, social scientists, and others. What we can do is try to educate them so the pull of that becomes not so seductive. And we can say, look, I know it's hard to believe, but the conceptual ladder's leaning against the wrong wall here. And we have to do some fundamental critical scholarship to help them. We'll never get to hard cases. I think B.F. Skinner lived and died of behavior. I don't think anybody could ever have got to him. Nobody got to Marx or Engels. You don't get to those guys, but we can get to the next generation. And we can make life uncomfortable for those within the discipline who ought to know better but don't. And so we have to be right now the voice of reason, even when there are no other, there's not a receptive audience. You got to create the audience. If you like that kind of academic work, then this is the place for you. I hope that answered your question. It should be out by the end of the year. It's out from Bloomsbury out of Britain. Highly recommend it. I don't make any money from it. Thank you.